Welcome to episode 8A. Yes, 8A. It's like an annex has been built right next door to episode 8. They got planning permission. They grabbed the garden. They just built another episode right next door to episode 8. How dare they? That's ruined the value of episode 8 now. Now episode 8A is right next door. It's ruined all the views. Anyway, episode 8A. Near-death experiences. This is the full talk that Dr. Mark Fox gave us on that night, all those days ago. So this is Mark's presentation. On the night we had questions afterwards, which we didn't come out too clearly on the film. So if you were there and you're thinking, oh no, they asked my questions, we didn't. We've edited those out. But this is the full talk Mark gave, and it makes for very interesting listening. So do check Mark out. At the end of the video, there's the information of his website is on there, so you can dig a bit more into some of his research and some of his theories. But for now, enjoy this conversation, or this lecture, this mini lecture, this talk. I'm probably talking too much now. We should just get on with the talk, shouldn't we? Let's just get on with the talk. Here's Dr. Mark Fox talking about the thing that is known as near-death experience.
Well, good evening, everybody. And Trish and I bring you greetings from Kidderminster Baptist Church, in fact. We don't get to come to Birmingham very often. We're not in this neck of the woods very often, but we were kind of across here just 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago tomorrow, in fact, we decided to jet off for a well-deserved break in the sun. And we like to go to Greece. So just 4 weeks ago tomorrow, we were jetting off on our holidays. I don't know whether you've ever seen that programme, Holidays from Hell. I used to think it was made up until we went to Skiathos in the middle of Storm Daniel, which in fact while we were there was upgraded to a hurricane. And we arrived there on the Friday, and it was okay on the Saturday and on the Sunday. And then the weather started to change on the Monday, but by the Tuesday it really got quite interesting. We were overlooking a road that led to the sea, and as we watched, and as the thunder crashed and the lightning flashed, the road outside the hotel, first of all it became a little trickle, then it became a little stream, then it became a big stream, then it became a torrent, then it became a raging torrent. Then the road was washed away, and then the power went out, and then we lost the water, and it didn't come back on for several days. And in my experience there, it's actually worse to be without water than it is to be without power. And of course the tea lights were brought out because there was no lighting in the hotel. But we were in a difficult situation because had the lights caught fire in the hotel, we couldn't have actually escaped because we would have been swept out to sea and drowned. So it was kind of devil and very muddy sea territory, to be honest. And fortunately, we lived to tell the tale, but for a while we were in a situation of life-threatening danger. And then the question became, do we try and claim some compensation off the tour operator touring or not? So we had a moral dilemma. After all, it's not their fault that we arrived in the middle of the worst weather in living memory on Skiathos. So anyway, we kind of wrestled with that, and we're still waiting to hear from the company. So why am I telling you this? Because the use of the term near-death experience has changed. It's mutated in recent years. And now it seems to be used quite a lot to denote any situation of life-threatening danger that you managed to survive, being caught up in the chaos of Storm Daniel, for example, and living to tell the tale. I'm not going to use it like that. In fact, I'm going to use it in a very specific and completely different sense. But here's the first thing you might not know about near-death experiences. And in fact, the title of my talk tonight is at least 8 things you might not know about near-death experiences. And here's the first thing that you might not know. The term itself can be, and frequently is, used in more than one sense. So how am I going to use it tonight? Well, 3/4 of the way through the 20th century, a philosophy lecturer turned medical doctor, Raymond Moody, actually coined the term near-death experience. Blame him. He started it. Before his book, Life After Life, published in 1975 by Mockingbird Press, the term near-death experience didn't exist at all. And he coined it, and he used it in a very specific sense. And this is the sense I'm going to be using it in tonight. To denote those odd and unusual experiences that people report when they've been near to death. In fact, some of those people report experiences that occurred even after they were pronounced clinically dead. Wow. I mean, imagine that. Being dead, but still being aware. Even hear yourself being pronounced clinically dead by the attending doctor. And it happens, believe it or not. You know, the dullest book on near-death experiences that I ever read was the one that contained no actual examples of near-death experiences at all. Just analysis. Page after page, no examples. It was actually about a range of unusual experiences, but the thing about these kinds of unusual experiences, including near-death experiences, is that it's the examples that really, well, bring them to life. So, this is the second thing you might not know about near-death experiences. If you really want to find out about them, you need to hear some accounts of them, either at first hand or via the work of researchers like Moody, who collected approximately 120 near-death experiences for his 1975 book and presented them apparently verbatim. Actually, that's far and away the best part of the book, the biggest section, the one with the examples in. As a teenager, I devoured those accounts, indeed, as if they were wholly written. So let's listen to some examples from Moody's book before we go any further, just so we know what we're going to be talking about. And here's the first. I was in the hospital, but they didn't know what was wrong with me. So Dr. James, my doctor, sent me downstairs to the radiologist for a liver scan so that they could find out. First, they tested this drug they were going to use on my arm, since I had a lot of drug allergies. But there was no reaction, so they went ahead. When they used it this time, I arrested on them. I heard the radiologist who was working on me go over to the telephone, and I heard very clearly as he dialed it. I heard him say, "Dr. James, I've killed your patient, Mrs. Martin." And I knew I wasn't dead. I tried to move or let them know, but I couldn't. when they were trying to resuscitate me, I could hear them telling how many cc's of something to give me, but I didn't feel the needles going in. I felt nothing at all when they touched me. And this is often how near-death experiences, or sometimes I'm going to say NDEs for short, typically start. Okay, so what happens next? Often this. Another one of Moody's subjects told him, I began to experience the most wonderful feelings. I couldn't feel a thing in the world except peace, comfort, ease, just quietness. I felt that all my troubles were gone, and I thought to myself, well, how quiet and peaceful, and I don't hurt at all. So, according to Moody, or at least the people he interviewed, dying was nothing to be feared. Quite the opposite. But there was more. As one of Moody's respondents told him, I had a very bad allergic reaction to a local anaesthetic and I just quit breathing. I had a respiratory arrest. The first thing that happened, it was real quick, was that I went through this dark black vacuum at super speed. You could compare it to a tunnel, I guess. I felt like I was riding on a roller coaster train at an amusement park, going through this tunnel at a tremendous speed. This, then, is a near-death experience. Hearing yourself being pronounced clinically dead, feeling wonderful, entering a period of darkness. But there's even more. Listen to what this car crash victim told Moody. I heard this awful sound, the side of the car being crushed in. And there was just an instant during which I seemed to be going through a darkness, an enclosed space. It was very quick. Then I was sort of floating about 5 feet above the street, about 5 yards away from the crash, I'd say. And I heard the echo of the crash dying away. I saw people come running and crowding around the car, and I saw my friend get out of the car, obviously in shock. I could see my own body in the wreckage among all those people and could see them trying to get it out. My legs were all twisted and there was blood all over the place. And there it is, another feature of the near-death experience, the so-called out-of-body experience, very often reported by people as part of their near-death experiences. Moody reported a lot of examples of out-of-body experiences in his book, and here's another example he cited. As my being went out of my body, it seemed that a large end left first and the small end last. It was a very light feeling, very. There was no strain on my body. The feeling was totally separate. The most striking point of the whole experience was the moment when my being was suspended above the front part of my head. It was almost like it was trying to decide whether it wanted to leave or to stay. It seemed as though time was standing still. Wow. Time's moving on, I know, but we can't leave our description here. There's more to the near-death experience even than this. In fact, you may consider the next testimony extract the most moving of all, perhaps the most revealing at least. The surviving respondent told Moody, I had this experience when I was giving birth to a child. The delivery was very difficult and I lost a lot of blood. The doctor gave me up and told my relatives that I was dying. However, I was quite alert through the whole thing. And even as I heard him saying this, I felt myself coming to. As I did, I realised that all these people were there, almost in multitudes it seems, hovering around the ceiling of the room. They were all people I had known in my past life, but who had passed on before. I recognised my grandmother and a girl I had known when I was in school, and many other relatives and friends. It seems that I mainly saw their faces and felt their presence. They all seemed pleased. It was a very happy occasion, and I felt that they had come to protect or to guide me. It was almost as if I was coming home, and they were there to greet or to welcome me. And all this time, I had the feeling of everything light and beautiful. It was a beautiful and glorious moment. We could end here and start our analysis proper. After all, what could top that? But there's more. And like our Lord at Cana, I've saved the best till last. In perhaps the most dramatic testimony extract he presented in his whole book, Moody gave us this. I got up and walked into the hall to go and get a drink, and it was at this point, as they found out later, that my appendix ruptured. I became very weak and I fell down. I began to feel a sort of drifting, a movement of my real being in and out of my body, and to hear beautiful music. I floated on down the hall and out the door onto the screened-in porch. There it almost seemed that clouds, a pink mist really, began to gather around me. And then I floated right straight on through the screen, just as though it weren't there. And up into this pure, crystal clear light. An illuminating white light. It was beautiful and so bright, so radiant, but it didn't hurt my eyes. It's not any kind of light you can describe on earth. I definitely didn't see a person in this light, and yet it has a special identity. It definitely does. It is a light of perfect understanding and perfect love. The thought came into my mind, lovest thou me? This was not exactly in the form of a question, but I guess the connotation of what the light said was, if you do love me, go back and complete what you began in your life. And all during this time, I felt as though I was surrounded by an overwhelming love and compassion. And there it is. The being of light, as Moody termed it, or him, or them, or whoever. Actually, Moody made clear that he thought the light was a constant, but it was overlaid or wrapped around or interpreted in terms of a particular person's faith and or background. So a Buddhist, for example, might call the light shunyata. A Jewish person might describe it as an angel. An atheist might simply call it a light. And a Christian, a Baptist maybe. Well, in the final example I'm going to cite for now, we read this. I heard the doctor say that I was dead, and that's when I began to feel as though I were tumbling, actually kind of floating through this blackness, which was some kind of enclosure. There are not really words to describe this. Everything was very black, except that way off from me, I could see this light. It was a very, very brilliant light, but not too large at first. It grew larger as I came nearer and nearer to it. I was trying to get to that light at the end because I felt that it was Christ, and I was trying to reach that point. It was not a frightening experience. It was more or less a pleasant thing. For immediately, being a Christian, I had connected the light with Christ, who said, I am the light of the world. I said to myself, if this is it, if I am to die, then I know who waits for me at the end, there in that light. And there we have it, the near-death experience. And how do we know all this? Because, of course, every person who apparently died didn't stay dead. Medical science is a wonderful thing, and bodies can survive even the most massive traumas, often against all the odds. So each of the temporarily dead that Moody spoke to returned, but with a tail. And sometimes that tale had a sting in it. For, as another one of his respondents told him, after I came back, I cried off and on for about a week because I had to live in this world after seeing that one. I didn't want to come back. Phew, such a lot to take in. We could stop now and head straight to the questions, but we've a way to go yet. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that was one man's research. What about others? Did anybody else try to replicate Moody's findings? If so, what did they find? And the answers to this related cluster of questions bring us bang up to date, because in the 48 years since Moody's groundbreaking study, a whole load of other researchers have interviewed many thousands of brought back near-death survivors and have found in many cases exactly what Moody found. People told and continue to tell of episodes at or near the point of death in which they heard themselves being pronounced clinically dead, felt bliss and peace, journeyed through darkness, saw their own bodies as if from outside, met with deceased relatives and friends, and encountered a light being variously described before returning to life, often reluctantly and only sometimes by choice. And this is the third thing that you might not have known about near-death experiences. Something's going on. It really is. The question is, what? And that, as they say, is the $64,000 question, or yen, or pound sterling, or rubles, or euros, or whatever, because, and this is the fourth thing you may not know about near-death experiences, they're reported all over the world by people of all creeds and colours, of all religions and none. What you believe might shape the experience you have, but it doesn't seem to dictate whether you'll have a near-death experience or not. What you believe, or indeed don't believe, doesn't seem to have any bearing on whether you have one of these experiences. Moody found this early on, and other researchers, Ken Ring, Michael Sabom, Bruce Grayson, me, hundreds of others, have all heard more or less the same thing. On May the 3rd, 2007, in Praia da Luz, Portugal, Madeleine McCann tragically disappeared. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that terribly sad case and the devastating impact on the parents, Kate and Jerry. A while ago, I was reading Kate McCann's book about the disappearance of her daughter and came across a little known detail about the aftermath. 5 days after the disappearance, according to Kate, Jerry McCann, her husband, Madeleine McCann's father, was praying in the local chapel at Nossa Senhora de Luz when he had, in her words, an extraordinary spiritual experience. She goes on to write, Jerry suddenly became aware of a long tunnel with light at the far end of it. He felt himself enter the tunnel, and as he went deeper and deeper inside, it became wider and wider and brighter and brighter. He had never known anything like this before. Now, we don't have Jerry McCann's own description of the event, but its essence, an extraordinary spiritual experience involving a tunnel being traversed towards light, is clear from Kate's description. Yet as far as can be determined, Jerry McCann was nowhere near actual physical death at the time, although the depth of the crisis in which he found himself during those dreadful days can scarce be imagined. And consider, if you will, the following testimony, for which I uncovered for a book I wrote a while back on unusual experiences of light generally. We've got some there. The subject wrote, a friend, knowing I was in emotional distress, had asked me to pray for a fortnight at least as a trial of prayer. At the end of the fortnight, as it happened, I was at a concert with a friend. They were playing the choral symphony, Beethoven, and as I did not know the music well, I had retreated into my own thoughts, which were pretty depressing. I prayed to be taken out of the black pit of my own mind and selfishness, and suddenly, in answer, there was a rush of light which surrounded me, and at the same time seemed to melt my physical being, so that light welled up also from within me, or rather burst out of me, to meet the light that was without. With this light came bliss, happiness, 1,000,000 times stronger than anything I had experienced on earth, and on earth at times I had been completely happy. At the same time, I felt a cool breeze playing on me, and within me a whirling sensation and a feeling that I was somehow above myself, above my body. Again, it sounds very like a near-death experience, but this person, nowhere near death. And consider another testimony I uncovered during research for that same book. The subject, 3 months after a miscarriage, was, as she writes, near despair as I was walking down the country road to do the shopping in the village. Then it happened. She writes, suddenly I was enveloped, I can only call it that, and lifted high above the high bank and tall hedge on top, though by unseen and unfelt hands, enveloped in a wonderful, living, brilliant light. I saw a small deserted quarry or cutting below, but everything, plants, bushes, even the stones on the far side, were exuding a pulsating life and bathed in an unearthly brown golden light. It seemed an eternity. I was held aloft with the most wonderful and strange glow of peace and awareness of the wonder of God. Then I found myself standing on the road and looking to see if anyone had seen me. It was so vivid. No one was in sight. I walked onto the shops, but with an unutterable feeling of peace within me. My longing for another child just disappeared. And there is a postscript to this experience, which the subject adds and which I will also read. A few days afterwards, as the bank and hedge were too high to look over, I found by going up a side path I could look down, and it was exactly as I had seen it. Only the scene was just normal. We were newcomers to the area, and I'd never wondered what was behind the high bank and hedge. Combining those extracts that we've just heard, and beginning with Jerry McCann's experience, we have a description of extraordinary events involving feelings of peace, the traversing of a tunnel towards light, an encounter with light, and vivid out-of-body experiences, one of which was later dramatically verified. In other words, exactly the same as the so-called core components of the near-death experience. But these people were nowhere near death, although it should be carefully noted that each one was in a state of misery and profound crisis. And further testimonies could be added to further strengthen this conclusion. Thus, we come to the fifth thing that you might not have known about near-death experiences. You don't need to be near death to have one. Or at least the key core components of one. Although a state of crisis does seem to help. I'm going to leave this alone now and talk of near-death experiences in the sense of those peculiar experiences reported by persons in specifically end-of-life situations. But in passing, it is useful and perhaps instructive to note the existence of similar kinds of experiences where there is no apparent threat to life at all. Something we might reserve for the question and answer session at the end, perhaps, although not something that I feel I can explain. In fact, I'd like to stick with the out-of-body experience, that aspect of near-death experiences for a while. The literature is full of examples of people making observations whilst out of their bodies, which, as with the lady who saw behind the banking hedge correctly, later turned out to be correct. In one celebrated case, for example, a musician, Pam Reynolds, deliberately rendered clinically dead prior to an operation to resolve an aneurysm from her brain, reported seeing, whilst apparently out of her body in the operating theatre, something that, and I quote her, looked like an electric toothbrush, and it had a dent in it, a groove at the top where the saw appeared to go into the handle, but it didn't. And the saw had interchangeable blades too, but these blades were in what looked like a socket wrench case. Given that she was completely unconscious when wheeled into the operating theatre and didn't regain consciousness until she was out of it, how did she see that? The observation appears remarkable. But what did Pam Reynolds actually see? An electric toothbrush in an operating theatre? Researcher Michael Sabon examined the case in detail and determined that one of the tools used in the operation to remove the aneurysm from Reynolds' brain was a Midas Rex bone saw, an instrument that corresponded remarkably well with Reynolds' description of the mystery object. Yet how could she have seen the tool with which previously she had been completely unfamiliar whilst unconscious throughout the operation, unless she had somehow been apart from herself? That's a famous case within the annals of near-death experience research. Anecdotal, of course, but held up alongside equally anecdotal cases as a kind of proof that A, human beings possess some kind of soul, and B, as a kind of proof that when the brain stops working, that soul escapes, albeit, in Reynolds' case, temporarily. But is it really as straightforward as that? One remark made by UK near-death researcher Penny Sartori is of particular note at this point. A few years ago, she did something very interesting. She gained access to the intensive care unit at a local hospital and placed objects at strategic points but high up, invisible from the ground, but visible if you were floating around the ceiling. She waited for a period of time and then checked to see A, if anybody had had an out-of-body experience as part of their near-death experience, and B, of course, if they identified any of those peculiar objects. Well, she did find that some people reported out-of-body experiences during the period of the experiment, but not one of those persons correctly identified the hidden objects. Not one. And this, indeed, has been the result of every single hidden object study that has ever been carried out in the world ever in an intensive care unit. Because, of course, Sartori is not the only one who ever did it. It cries out to be done. And every single experiment that has been carried out, prospective and all the rest, has rendered a null return. Nobody sees the object. Ever. But there's another aspect of Penny Sartori's findings that I want to draw attention to here. She writes that one patient who reported a near-death experience accurately reported events that occurred around her while she was apparently out of her body, but that she made incorrect observations also, specifically of a piece of jewellery which she claimed was pinned to her hospital gown. This was later shown to be completely incorrect, as no jewellery is allowed into any operating room and strict checks are made to ensure that this instruction is complied with. Sartori concluded that the drugs given to this patient might have led to this misperception, which might therefore have simply been hallucinated by the patient. However, that is by no means an isolated case. For example, writing in the peer-reviewed Journal of Near-Death Studies, researcher Keith Augustine has made much of these incorrect observations in near-death experience testimony. One case he has cited was collected during a study of near-death experiences conducted at Evergreen State College in Washington and concerned a woman who had a ruptured fallopian tube. During her observations, whilst apparently apart from her physical body, she described how, and I quote, "I saw this little table over the operating table. You know, those little round trays like in a dental office where they have their instruments and all. I saw a little tray like that with a letter on it, addressed from a relative by marriage that she hadn't met." Remarking that there was in fact neither a letter nor such a round table in the operating room, Augustine concludes that this is further evidence that the experience was hallucinated and that audible cues in the operating theatre provided the input from which the hallucinated scenario was constructed. Another case that Augustine cites is taken from the research of Peter and Elizabeth Fenwick and involved a near-death experience that occurred during World War II when a soldier was attacked by aerial bombers. In this instance, despite seeing himself on the ground from a clear vantage point, apparently up above, he completely failed to observe two Sudanese persons who were plainly lying beside him in what should have been full view to anyone hovering above. Only when back in his normal physical surroundings did he see them. Augustine has made much of these and other cases he's collected in which persons made observations whilst outside of themselves which later turn out to be wrong. And you don't often hear about those on documentaries about near-death experiences, and you don't often read about them in NDE literature, but they exist. People get stuff uncannily right, like Pam Reynolds, and they get stuff completely wrong, as in those instances collected by Sartori and Keith Augustine. How then might we account for this curious mix of hits and misses, things that are right and things that are wrong? Well, important to note at this point is that this curious mix of hits and misses is very reminiscent of what is frequently reported in parapsychological literature generally. Mediums, for example, often deliver readings to sitters in which apparently and at times startlingly correct information is mixed with rather basic errors. While skeptics simply explain this away in terms of simple fraud or by cold readings, it's hard to invoke that explanation in terms of near-death experiences. It seems that any attempt to solve this as yet unexplained puzzle within NDE testimony must take the form of some kind of explanation or new paradigm which at the very least makes sense of this curious mixture of hits and misses, stuff that is right and wrong. For now, we note two more things you may not have known about near-death experiences before tonight. Number 6, for all their remarkably correct observations, people who have out-of-body experiences during their near-death experiences get things plain wrong too. And number 7, this interesting mix of hits and misses is replicated elsewhere within paranormal literature. In fact, you see it all over the place. Whatever could this mean? How long have we got?
So everyone leaves.
It's 11 minutes past. Given that he wrote so splendidly about so many matters of life and death, I've often wondered what C.S. Lewis would have made of near-death experiences. Alas, we'll never know, of course. But a while back, as I was rereading his book, Prayer, Letters to Malcolm, I had one of those aha moments. I've always had a soft spot for that book, although it never gets anything like the same attention as his more revered works, such as Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain. It's full of the most wonderful insights into a whole range of things, not just prayer. And whilst it's unclear if Lewis knew anything about what we would today call near-death experiences, as I reread Prayer, Letters to Malcolm, I began to wonder if it might be possible to build a bridge between what he wrote in that book regarding mystical experiences and the end-of-life near-death experiences that we've been considering. Mystical experiences. We don't have much of a mystical tradition in the Baptist Union, do we? Not in what might be called the classic sense, anyway. It's been a long time since I heard Evelyn Underhill quoted in a sermon at Kidderminster Baptist Church, that's for sure. So I recognise that this might be a bit new to some folks. Nevertheless, I hope the conclusions at least will be both clear and helpful as regards tonight's topic. And we'll take our bridge building stage by stage. So, key to building the bridge from C.S. Lewis's book on prayer to near-death experiences might lie in Lewis's careful and qualified recognition in chapter 12 of his book that some mystical experiences share a number of common features. 2, which he particularly highlights, are those of what he calls emptying and departure. Hence, he writes, what is common to all mystical experiences is the temporary shattering of our ordinary spatial and temporal consciousness and of our discursive intellect. In other words, for Lewis, during their experiences, mystics leave behind their usual ways of experiences and being, a leaving behind that is necessary if room is to be made for the transformed state of being that follows. Viewing this leaving behind, firstly in terms of emptying, Lewis uses an unusual analogy, writing that, and again I quote, "If wine glasses were conscious, I suppose that being emptied would be the same experience for each, even if some were to remain empty and some to be filled with wine and some broken." Following this with a very this-worldly analogy, that of embarking on a sea voyage, he turns to the motif of departure, writing, "All who leave the land and put to sea will find the same things: the land sinking below the horizon, the gulls dropping behind, the salty breeze. Tourists, merchants, sailors, pirates, missionaries, it's all one. Thus, as with emptyings, departures may easily be seen to share certain things in common. But the crucial point for our bridge building is the assertion that follows. For Lewis adds, this identical experience vouches for nothing about the utility or unlawfulness or final event of their voyages. This final assertion is key. On the one hand, for Lewis, the reality of mystical experience implies nothing regarding the usefulness or rightness of mystical practice itself. Neither does it say anything about the sanctity of the mystic. For those things, something else is required. But that needn't detain us, because more important for our exercise in bridge building, in fact central to it, is Lewis's assertion that emptyings and especially departures must not be confused with destinations. Hence, and again addressing mysticism, he writes, I do not at all regard mystical experience as an illusion. I think it shows that there is a way to go before death, out of what might be called this world, out of the stage set, out of this, but into what? It's the into what that is the key. Departures may indeed share things in common, Lewis is saying, but this tells nothing about what awaits at the end of each respective mystical journey once this world has been left behind. It is surely here that the relevance of Lewis's insights into mysticism for the understanding of near-death experiences will hopefully have become clear. For surely, like the mystic, the near-death experiencer has in some sense embarked on a process of departing. Hence, just as the mystic traveller is engaged in a journey which entails the leaving behind of any normal sense of consciousness, so too has the near-death traveller. How could it be otherwise? In a situation where the body's various systems and subsystems have begun to shut down, we could hardly expect the continuation of normal states of consciousness, a fact which near-death experiencers' testimonies vividly show. In fact, we can go further, because we might even see this shutting down process as in some sense akin to emptying. But it is the leaving behind process that I want to stay with just for a few moments longer. As we've just seen, Lewis reminds us that all departures bear family resemblances. Why then would we expect the departures described by persons having near-death experiences to be any different? And in fact, as we saw at the beginning of tonight's talk, the departures described in near-death experiencers' testimonies do indeed bear striking resemblances with recurrent descriptions of bliss, tunnels, lights, out-of-body experiences, and so on. But surely, objects the sceptic, these are just tricks of the brain. For Lewis, this is to miss the point, certainly as regards mysticism. Hence, he writes, I shouldn't be at all surprised if it could be shown that a diabolical mysticism or drugs produced experiences indistinguishable from those of the great Christian mystics. Departures are all alike. It is the landfall that crowns the voyage. Departures are all alike. It is the landfall that crowns the voyage. And herein lies the crux of the whole matter for our current purposes. Whatever the processes which may be occurring in a dying brain, these tell us nothing about where the near-death experiencer actually goes. This is still hidden up ahead around the corner, over the brow of the hill, out of sight. And please note, in saying this, I in no sense intend to denigrate the experiences of those who have embarked on their voyages, only to temporarily return. Far from it. According to the very many accounts we have from near-death experiences, the emptying involved in this particular setting out is wonderful. The departure both blissful and thrilling. Should God, in his grace, have afforded his creatures such experiences as they leave this world, I wouldn't be at all surprised. But up ahead lies something infinitely greater still, a landfall that none has seen, a crowning of the voyage unfathomably wonderful. I'd like to think that had Lewis directly addressed what we now know as near-death experiences, he might have said something like I've suggested here. His meditations on mysticism in prayer letters to Malcolm hint at least at this, but for now, and thanks to Lewis, we may, at least tentatively, add another point to our list of things you might not know about near-death experiences. Point number 8. People often speak of near-death experiences testimonies as descriptions of arrivals at other worlds, heaven, and so on. But it may be better to view their testimonies as descriptions of departures. This may even explain why so many of their descriptions are so similar. They're not arriving, they're leaving. Departures then. But what of destinations? And with this we close. And again, I'm mindful that we're all Baptists together, or at least some of us are. And so I'm self-consciously and deliberately adopting the Christian angle. Look, the thing that excites many people about near-death experiences is the possibility they offer of proving life after death, isn't it? Let's be clear on this point. When I was 15, faithless, heir to no discernible religious or spiritual tradition, it's what excited me. Hope for something up ahead, for something beyond this life. And in an increasingly faithless age, it's easy to see that appeal as only increasing. Hence the enduring popularity of near-death experiences. But what of faith? Of the Christian faith in particular? What do we as Christians really hope for? What kind of life after death does faith promise us? To answer this question, in closing, I'd like to compare and contrast 3 final testimonies. Firstly, 2 from Moody's 1975 book, the book that gave us the term near-death experience almost 50 years ago. And here's the first. The subject writes, or told Moody, the doctors and nurses were pounding on my body to try and get IVs started and to get me back. And I kept trying to tell them, leave me alone. All I want is to be left alone. Quit pounding on me. But they didn't hear me. So I tried to move their hands to keep them from beating on my body, but nothing would happen. I couldn't get anywhere. It was like, I don't really know what happened, but I couldn't move their hands. And I tried to move them, yet when I would give their hands a stroke, their hands were still there. I don't know whether my hand was going through their hand, around it, or what. I didn't feel any pressure against their hands when I was trying to move them. And here's the second testimony, which is very similar. The person told Moody, people were walking up from all directions to get to the car wreck. I could see them, and I was in the middle of a very narrow walkway. Anyway, as they came by, they wouldn't seem to notice me. They would just keep walking with their eyes straight ahead. As they came real close, I would try to turn around to get out of their way, but they would just walk right through me. Wow. Those people sound like, well, like for a while, they were ghosts. Recall, they didn't hear me. I tried to move their hands to keep them from beating on my body, but nothing would happen. I didn't feel any pressure against their hands when I was trying to move them. As they came by, they wouldn't seem to notice me. I would try to turn around to get out of their way, but they would just walk through me. Now let's compare a third and final account from Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, verses 36 to 43. Another account of a person who died but still lived. While the disciples were still talking, the risen Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." While he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet, and while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. The contrast is clear, as I hope is the point. Perhaps it's to Jesus, the risen Jesus, that we should look as our ultimate destination. Departures are all alike, said Lewis. Perhaps our arrivals after death are too, not as disembodied and wraith-like ghosts, but as solid, substantial beings, capable of being seen and touched, capable of eating fish, risen. Because this, surely, is the Christian hope. Not simply for the escape of the soul, but for the resurrection of the body. Paul talks of Jesus as the first fruits. He was the first, Paul seems to be implying, and his resurrection guarantees that ours will surely follow. Resurrection, that is, not escape. After all, as theologian Oscar Kuhlman once wrote, there's no need for Easter if we're all immortal anyway. Perhaps some way might be found to combine both things. Perhaps in these near-death experience testimonies we're viewing something like the foothills of resurrection. A peep into what comes next, perhaps, rather than a view of the true towering peaks that await. Perhaps. And perhaps, at the end of the day, it all comes down to where your faith really lies. In the testimonies collected by Moody and others, with all their fabulousnesses and foibles and faults, or in a God of grace who keeps faith with the dead. In my heart of hearts, I know where my faith lies, and where my faith is, my hope is too.